All right, good morning and afternoon, everyone. Once again, as I said earlier, this is Michael Corcione. I'm Managing Director at Quotium Cybersecurity and Data Protection Services. Joined here today with Rich Hudson.
Hi, everyone.
Rich is one of our lead consultants here, really oversees a lot of Quotium's projects and ongoing support services in our virtual CISO offering for clients. So we appreciate your time today. We know cybersecurity, as always, remains hot in the news, always at the top of the regulators' radar, and of course, even some recent information on data protection, third-party oversight, with some recent news from firms in London and data sharing practices and privacy, and a very large social media company, all tying into data protection. But what we really want to talk about today, because a lot of our clients, are regulated firms, a lot of those joining today's call are under a regulatory oversight. And that's really where you need to address how you're going to approach your program, because they're the ones that will come in and have a review and get an understanding of what you're doing, and having in place what they want to see or what their expectations are is really helpful. A lot of firms somewhat struggle if they haven't been through a review before, and when that first conversation with the regulator gets started, if it gets off to the wrong foot, or it's something that is more of an explanation you have to give to the regulator, is something they understand that's crisp and clear, it makes for a longer conversation. So Rich, you've been through about how many regulatory exams over your career?
Too many, at least 50. And definitely the regulators, when it comes to cybersecurity, there are certain things that are expected, and as we have in the subject title, the cybersecurity program is one of the key elements of any examination if you ever have to speak to the regulators about cybersecurity in your firm.
So as an information security officer, you've dealt with SEC reviews, New York Department of Financial Services, and some of the first ones, right?
Yeah, I've been through it. So I've heard straight from the regulators what they're looking for. And I've certainly gone through the pains and the tribulations of the exam itself. So yeah, we certainly can share that with you today, and that's our intention.
And so when I've been at meetings with you with clients, and they come to you and they say, well, the regulators were here and they asked us, what is your program? I've heard you say that was something you heard them ask a ways back, and it always seems a little confusion as to specifically what is the program, right?
Right. So typically in a regulatory examination, they'll send you a first day letter, and that would include certain things that are coming to examine. And they may also include a request list of documents, reports, and so on. In an examination that I was a part of, that letter came with a list and the requirements they were looking for. And the day before the opening meeting, they asked to see the cybersecurity program. And that was not in the original request list. So this is why we're having this presentation today, so that you're prepared.
And I know, Rich, one of the clients, we can't say who, that we talked to, had a review from a regulator. They sent over all the documents on the request list, and they came back and said, why are they still asking me for my program? I sent them all this stuff. And I think that's where the confusion lies, is because people think a program, is all this stuff, and it is. And I'll actually flip to the next slide and show, what are a lot of those components that are in a program. And at the top here, it shows, an overarching blanket, and then a bunch of policies and some procedures that are laid out there. And then we get clients that will say, here's a large presentation, and here's what my program is. And Rich, these are all components of a program, but maybe not up front what the regulator wants to see initially.
Exactly. So for those who have received a first day letter, and for those who will be receiving their first day letters, if it's cybersecurity related, when the examiner says, I need to see your cybersecurity program, what's happened in a lot of instances is to provide all these documents that you see here. And that's basically your WISP, your network security policy, patching, and so on. So in a lot of instances, all these documents are provided, and that's not exactly what the examiner is looking for when they ask for the program. These are elements of the program, but the program itself is something that stands on its own.
And what that standalone item is basically a document, but very specific what's in the document. We've had clients that said, here's our written information security policy that covers so many of those things on the previous slide and very detailed and laid out, but it's not the program. They got a mark from a regulator saying, no, you need to satisfy this requirement. And so you went through a nice healthy discussion with the client to explain where that clarity was. It took some clarification a few times, but a little bit of guidance on really what is this document that firms want to see.
Right. So the program is, as it said, it's a document. It's not a policy or a procedure or standard and so on. It's a high-level document that basically describes the approach for the firm and how they handle security. So just to make it very clear, it is by itself, as it says, a program document. It has to be approved by management, and where you have a board, the board of directors, and that's a requirement from the regulators. And as we have also on the slide, there is to be support from management to promote effective IT governance by these three bullets here. So the program should reflect the security culture, how you define and communicate responsibilities and accountability in the firm, and also making sure that there are adequate resources to support the program implementation. The program, I can't emphasize it enough, when you're asked to provide your security program, it's a separate document from your policies and procedures and so on for cybersecurity.
So, Rich, one thing, and actually to share with everybody on the call, there is the option to ask questions during the webinar, and we have one coming in that I want to reply to, and we'll try to catch them as we go through the call. We do have, in a little housekeeping I forgot earlier, timed out to about between 11:30 and 11:45, depending on questions and time that were coming in. The one that's coming across here from a firm says, we don't have a board, we're small, is this applicable to us? And so whether it's a board, a committee, a general partner, a risk committee, basically it's got to be a leadership type document. Often what will happen when information security needs to be addressed in an organization, people feel it's IT's situation and IT will take care of it. But IT can spend all the money that you give them and you won't get to zero risk. And so leadership needs to help identify what are the risk appetite for the firm in regards to cost, business continuity, and other areas like they manage risk from an investment perspective. So it has to come from the top, and it's a document that has to be reviewed by leadership, and really the roles and responsibilities identified in there will formulate really right to the top of the org chart. Right, Rich?
Yep. And just to add here on the program, it has to be very clear that anyone who reads it, whether it be, again, regulators or even an auditor or whoever comes to review your cybersecurity, it has to paint a picture of how the firm manages security. So that when you provide, if you have provided in the past incident response policy or vendor management policy, those specific documents only describe those particular areas. The cybersecurity program is like an overall document that anyone who reads it will say, okay, yes, they get it on how the firm approaches and handles security.
Yeah, when we talk to clients and we're going through the early parts of, well, what is the program, what is in that document, we usually really point to the 4 items that are in the table of contents. And so risk identification, risk measurement, risk mitigation, risk monitoring and reporting. So the SEC cybersecurity guidance, the New York Department of Financial Services guidance, the EU General Data Protection Regulation, all of these regulators have listed in there when it comes to things around the level of resources a firm needs to apply for their technical controls, that they should be in line with the firm's risk appetite and the firm's resources. And so what that means, as I said before, is you could spend a lot of money, but do you really need to, or should you? And what they allow firms to do is to identify what they feel is appropriate based on their risk and their resources. same way they evaluate investment risk, right? And so having a document that lays that out up front and sets the tone and the responsibilities as to how the firm approaches that risk identification, the risk measurement, the risk mitigation, and the monitoring and reporting, which in some cases will include risk acceptance, and the fact that you don't necessarily see it's necessary to spend exorbitant amounts of dollars, and you'll put in some additional monitoring and some additional oversight. And so that's really the tone. The regulators are very courteous that they allow firms to take this risk-based approach. Early versions of the NYDFS cybersecurity regulation were very prescriptive and onerous. And so they heard feedback from the community that it needed to be more of a risk-based approach, and they accommodated that. And so now what they're just asking firms to do is at least show us how you're going through evaluating risk, who's responsible for determining risk, and what was your process. And that'll fall into inherent risk as well as residual risk. But Rich, I know you go through these discussions all the time with clients on these 4 topics. Give a little thought. I think the identification one is where firms kind of really also struggle as to what's really part of that.
Yeah, definitely. As it says, the 4 key elements of the program are here. The risk identification is first and foremost where your approach to identifying risk throughout the firm is key. And typically, this is where you do your assessment. Your risk assessment has to include several elements: how you identify threats, how you identify vulnerabilities. You have to assess your logical security, your servers, your databases, your network. You have to also look at your physical security also as relates to cybersecurity. So that's basically the elements around the first box that you see there, risk identification. And one thing to quickly note is that the cybersecurity program document is typically on average like 10 pages. It's not an extensive document. It should be pretty clear and to the point on how these 4 elements are addressed within the firm.
So I have a question coming in, Rich, where somebody says for identification, I do penetration tests. And so is that enough?
Penetration testing, not enough. I mean, it's one of the ways of identifying risk. So definitely when it comes to identifying your risk, again, as pertains to cybersecurity, there are several things that have to be done. Pen testing is one, and with pen testing, you have to do both internal and external, and that includes phishing, social engineering, war dialing, and so on. And you also have to look at vulnerability scanning. You also have to, as I said before, assess your environment from hardware, software, and so on. There are tools out there that can help you to do it. The regulators have provided a tool that they have insisted that firms use, in addition to whatever tool you may already have in your environment. But the key element of the program here is where you start, and you have to be able to identify your risk within the firm from a cyber perspective.
So a question comes across, Rich, is what tool, and so I'll give a little color and then share back to you. And so one of the tools it looks at is the FFIEC, the Federal Financial Examination Inspection Council. It's a tool put up by the regulators. It measures specifically firms' inherent risk. What are your technology footprint, connection points, office locations, number of users, items of that nature. So your inherent risk is pretty important. And then also goes through and reviews your maturity over a series of questions, several domains around governance, protective, detective controls, incident response, vendor management, training and awareness, and understand what your firm is from a maturity perspective. And so when Rich talks about a regulator tool, and I mentioned earlier about something familiar for them, you can absolutely go out and do an assessment of your program with other frameworks in the industry. But ultimately something that the regulator recognizes is very helpful. And the FFIEC tool aligns to NIST, which is basically one of the worldwide leading standards recognized by everyone. And so it's very helpful to have what you're doing aligned to what they would expect to see, what they understand, especially if your team is very technical. And if you have a technical team, they can probably overachieve and do an assessment against other frameworks as well. But if they are very technical, they actually may be, a little above skill set of the regulator. And so it's really important to put your assessment in the lens that the regulator can understand. Rich, I'll give you a moment for Campbell.
Yeah, sure. And one of the key things, again, on the risk identification is to make sure that whatever you're going to put together, that it's something that will make sense to not just the regulators, but your internal leadership.
And one of the questions came in is, do we have examples of risk assessment or so on the screen? I mean, on the next one here, we talk about periodic self-assessments, which is really something you should be doing internally all the time. But ultimately, getting a third party is going to be very helpful with the regulators. We talk around this time of year when you're looking at tax services and fund accounting, and if you do an audit report at the end of 2016 by an external third party, something that you should be doing annually. And so getting those assessments done and somebody that's giving you that objective viewpoint. We also get a lot of people that will say we use an IT provider, a third-party provider, and so they take care of a lot of this. But one of the responsibilities of leadership and on your risk identification is to ensure that they're doing what they should be doing. And so that's also how you can manage risk, if they are taking care of certain control aspects, but validating that they're aligning to your information security policies. Penetration testing is part of it. Vulnerability testing is part of it. Other areas where you'll look and review as part of the risk assessment, like Rich mentioned, physical security, threat intelligence, partly of understanding if your inherent risk may increase. If you decide to do business in a territory that's maybe less ethical than others, that could increase your inherent risk, or trading a new type of security or an instrument that could deal with other third parties that are less mature than you're used to dealing with. All those should be evaluated, and really a good risk assessment blends with across different business units and getting their input, not necessarily having them being part of it, but getting their input. And Rich, you deal with a lot of international firms that have a presence here in New York, have global office, and I think that's where they need to collaborate more and bring some value with it.
Yeah, definitely. One of the key things for firms who have their home office overseas, where maybe it's centralized, where they do a global risk assessment, the regulators in the U.S. especially are looking for an assessment that is specific to the U.S. And if you have a global report, it would have to be tailored where you can extract the U.S. Pieces of that assessment. The regulators wouldn't want to look at a global report because certain things in that report wouldn't pertain to what they govern in terms of the U.S. entities. So definitely it's something to bear in mind when it comes to the home office. There has to be communication to let them understand what is required by the regulators here.
So another question coming in, actually a couple of them. Next one is asking, I mentioned the word maturity. And so what does that mean when coming through an assessment? It may be helpful if I come back a couple slides and look here where we talk about maturity, and you'll see where we talk about policies, procedures, and then on the bottom, monitoring, reporting. And so the view of doing an assessment and taking the approach that a regulator takes, like Rich said in the beginning, is they'll do a documentation request list. Send us your written information security policy, your acceptable use policy, your incident response, vendor management. We want to see these documents. And so from their view, that's a step up of maturity. First level is you're just not doing something. Next level is you're doing something ad hoc. And then the level of having it in policy is that it's formalized in policy. And there's statistics out there that will show firms that have something documented in policy versus not having in policy are 4 times less likely to suffer an information security breach. And so regulators will look at that. What they'll then look at from a level of maturity is going to fall down to procedures. And specifically on the procedures, are they in place, but also are they being reviewed, tested, and validated? And so you have your patch and vulnerability procedure. And a policy statement will say we keep all our systems up to date and according to our patching procedures. And in your patching procedures, it'll lay out how frequently you're doing your servers, your workstations, other mobile devices, and how this is enforced with the company, and then how it's validated. If it's an IT provider and the IT provider is taking responsibility for the patching of the systems, somebody at the organization level needs to be validating the IT provider is doing those patching procedures in accordance with the policy. Because probably a high percentage of the breaches you hear out there are because of it failed patch or vulnerability that wasn't updated.
Yeah, third-party risk is a huge issue, as Mike mentioned earlier, with a good social media friend out there who's having a problem now. But basically, going back to this slide, the elements of the program, as stated here, covers a lot of different areas: change management, vendor, incident, DCP, and so on. But the program document itself, can't emphasize it enough, has to be a separate document which includes these 4 elements. So as we said, risk identification, it's very important to go through, identify your risk, and make sure that it's very clear in the program. It explains how you go through and identify your risk. Yes, we can go to the next element, which is risk measurement.
Yep. So talking about measure risk, how do they measure risk, Rich?
Yeah, this is where you have to have some type of methodology, some type of tool to give you your statistics on your risk. You can have, as Mike mentioned before, a regulatory tool that identifies your inherent risk. There should be something that gives you a quantitative measure of your risk within the firm. And the cybersecurity assessment tool is one of them. It does help to show where the NIST framework aligns with your security environment. And when you get your results from pen testing, that's also a way you can measure the particular risk from any potential penetration. So the measurement is how you put your results into something that makes sense from a quantitative perspective.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this, what it comes down to also is, firms say, well, how do I show like a return of investment on a product or a solution that you put in, and IT justifying to leadership. And so you may determine that the metrics, let's say, to put in an email filter system. And so it's really a gap capturing before of how many spams may have come through, how many instances there were of phishing emails coming into the environment post a solution going in. Now you put in a solution and that has gone down significantly. So you've reduced now the threat of phishing emails. Same thing if you had a risk or exposure of access to a building and being able to measure and monitor that type of activity. So really it's around getting metrics and showing how some of your tools are reducing exposure within the organization. We talked before about risk appetite. I think a good analogy for technology people is business continuity and time to bring systems back online, and that duration, so that service level requirement, and measuring that and understanding the same thing when it comes around other aspects that you may measure in the firm. So definitely the risk measurement is going to be a component that the regulators want to see you're putting some tangible numbers behind. We think this probably is going to be most focused, I think, also in the vendor management side, where you're measuring your vendors based on their current capabilities. And we have clients that we work with, and they say, well, how do you know what's the quantitative score to put together? How do you weight different questions? You actually want to do it consistently. So up front, it's a business decision on how you want to weight certain aspects to come up with where that score is going to be. And then ultimately keep it consistent so you can measure now if there's a delta up or down. And that's really how you'll start to gauge and build a program. And it takes time as you build over things. So the next one would come to, Rich, on the screen is risk mitigation.
Yep.
Which a lot of people think means a lot of money.
Yeah, it depends on the risk that you have identified. So once you've gone through and identified your risk and you have some type of measurement of that risk, the next step is to mitigate the risk. So in the program, you would document or highlight how you go about mitigating risk. And typically you would definitely have to make sure that your standards, your policies and procedures are reflective of how you mitigate that risk. And you have to make sure that your tools, if it's decided that based on the risk you have to purchase something to mitigate that risk, or if you have to accept the risk, that is described in this section of the cybersecurity program.
And I think one of the things on the mitigation before where, as people talk about, well, the remediation, we're going to spend some money and have to put tools and technologies in. Probably one of the least expensive risk mitigation areas is the end user, the human risk, which tends to be the weakest link. And so a remediation effort there is training, awareness, doing phishing exercises to understand where people need additional training, even putting up signs and posters in break rooms. It's pretty easy to have these conversations with people. It's in the news every day. And really for people just to understand, better data handling practices, the general data protection regulation that rolls out in the EU, which really covers a lot of firms, because if you deal with any individual information of an EU resident or somebody residing in the EU, you have something in scope. And so it's ultimately now, how do you instruct your users that are handling that data, what's the appropriate secure practices to make sure that it's in line with the regulation. Ultimately, a policy needs to be put in place, some procedures defined, but those are useless unless the employees are given some training and guidance on how they apply and how they need to be adhered to. Mm-hmm. So we're coming up towards the tail end of the 30 minutes, Rich. We'll run just a little bit over because we answered a few questions. I do want to come into the last bullet on the risk monitoring and reporting. And we know the reporting is something painful because it's work afterwards that people have to do after the fact, but it's pretty critical. Yeah. And from the regulator view, mm-hmm. They deem it as something that is a must-have. And so, what are they going to be looking for from reporting, and depending on the size of the organization?
Yeah. So basically, here with the risk monitoring reporting, it ties the first three boxes together. So you identify your risk, you measure your risk, then you mitigate those that you can mitigate. Then the next step is that you continue to monitor your mitigation methods to make sure it's working appropriately. And if there's any particular issue, it should be addressed timely. So when you begin to monitor your risk, the next step is to report any particular issues from reporting. And that more or less is to make sure that your mitigation is working the way you expect. So you just have to make sure on this particular part of the program, this element, that you include how you'd be doing the risk monitoring, and that can be receiving metrics. There should be certain what's called key risk indicators that can be developed to monitor the particular risk that you have to mitigate.
And I think ultimately what people have come down to realize in cyber and information security, it's not a check the box exercise. It's something that goes on in perpetuity, and really where the monitoring, the reporting has to link back to is the identification. And so over the years, we've had many times a client has brought us in that's had some other people in doing work before. They've done a vulnerability scan or a pen test and, said, okay, we're good. We've got that done. And then what really needs to be shown to a regulator is what happened after that test. What was the follow-up? Was the remediation efforts that were done? And once they were done, were they retested? And so it's just a continual process that really has to be built into a firm's business as usual. But the reporting becomes less painful if firms are doing it more frequently, and you're really going through and making sure you have the right people from the first three phases of identification, measurement, and mitigation.
Right. Yeah, the regulators want to make sure that your program is working, and that's where the reporting aspect comes in. So the reporting has to reflect the risk identified, how it's being measured, how it's being mitigated, how it's being tracked or monitored, and that the firm is on top of their program. And basically, previous slide that we had in all those policies and procedures, those are the rules that the rest of the firm should be following. And you get different reporting key risk indicators from all these areas, but the regulator wants to see that all these policies and procedures are being followed, and that's why they ask in your first day letter to provide your policies and procedures for cybersecurity, because the next step will be, okay, show us that you are following what you have written, and that's where the reporting comes in.
Yeah, and I truly think what you'll see, and if you look back on the trends of regulators around Anti-Money Laundering and Bank Secrecy Act, where real sufficient fines have been handed out, and the industry is really now morphing those in with cyber and information security and calling it financial crimes. And so when it comes to these categories that the regulators are looking in, and you see any of these firms that have been handed down fines and penalties, a lot of it always has some element of insufficient policies and procedures, which means they either didn't exist or they were put in place and then nobody trained the staff on them to have a good understanding of what needed to be done, so they were poorly followed, or there was no control testing, or there was control testing that showed inefficiencies that weren't addressed. And so a lot of it will always come back to the policies and procedures, the formality. The regulators take this approach because they know it works. And so ultimately, if things are laid out with definitive tests, definitive processes, that's good security. That's really what it looks like, and that's what the regulators are looking for. So I do apologize. We ran a few minutes past the 11:30. I do thank those that stayed on a little bit longer. I thank those that came through with some questions. I apologize for those that we did not have time to answer your questions. We will definitely follow up on those individually, and the content and the information will be shared out after the presentation. Rich, I thank you for your time.
Yes, and thanks for all those who participated, and this was very good, I think, to share our experience with the audience, to make sure they understand that there's a difference between a cyber program and a cyber program.
Well, I hope it got across clear. I wouldn't be surprised, based on what we've seen with others, if there is a little confusion afterwards. And of course, if there is, we'd be more than happy to help people with follow-up questions post today. So thank you again, everybody, for your time. We wish you a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.